Welcome to the only daily podcast focusing on compliance news of the day. Each morning, start your day with a cup of coffee and Tom Fox, the voice of compliance, to hear about 4 of the top compliance, corruption, or leadership stories you will need to start your day. The Daily Compliance News is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.
The Daily Compliance News for September 8, 2021, the ABC fight in Central America. And we begin with that story from Univision, a first-time contributor to the Daily Compliance News. The United States has begun to step up its anti-corruption efforts in Central America following the announcement of a special task force in June during a visit to Guatemala by Vice President Kamala Harris. Teams of prosecutors are embedded in U.S. embassies in Central America. These so-called resident legal advisors are trained in targeting criminals with a nexus back to the United States in corruption and a variety of other issues. But there is corruption endemic in these countries, which will help or rather hurt this effort, and accountability and effective efforts to unravel their corruption systems will be a challenge going forward. Next up, from Dylan Tokar over at the Wall Street Journal Risk and Compliance Journal, the U.S. is probing Raytheon's dealings with a Qatari defense contractor based upon a civil lawsuit filed and later dismissed in California involving the Qatari military. The U.S. is looking at whether payments by Raytheon to a consultant for the Qatar Armed Forces may have been bribes intended for a member of the country's ruling family. The dismissed lawsuit included allegations that Raytheon had funneled around $1.9 million in payoffs through Digital Sola Solutions, a Doha, Qatar-based defense and security consulting firm that is or was part owned by a brother of the country's emir. The allegations in the lawsuit were that Digital Sola Systems was contracted to Raytheon, yet delivered no services. So if this was a zombie or fraudulent contractor, that's clearly a way for bribes to be paid. And indeed, Raytheon's compliance function raised a red flag around the ownership of this entity by the relative in question. So Raytheon under FCPA scrutiny. Next up, from the New York Times Deal book, it looks at diversity in private equity boardrooms, which have found just that 1% of the literally thousands of director positions over the past 20 years have been given to black directors. This includes Anderson Horowitz, Blackstone, Carlyle, Greylock, KKR, and Sequoia, among many of the companies that were looked at. The investment firms that provide funding and mentorship could make fostering diversity a priority, but that is not happening. Interestingly, Dealbook suggests that companies prioritize diversity before they're on the cusp of going public, and they have to disclose this type of information, and you certainly want to get ahead of it. And finally, Matt Kelly looks at the Kraft Foods SEC settlement and sees a similar tone at the top and indeed conduct within the organization that he saw in Wells Fargo, all in radical compliance. The Daily Compliance News is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network and a proud member of C-Suite Radio. Thanks so much for listening. I hope you'll join me again tomorrow.